Now, some might remember I made a video the other day mocking the fact that members of the public can and will likely make Matt Hancock eat a kangaroo's meat and 2 veg. You know, on that TV show, I'm a Celebrity, Get Me Out of Here. This would obviously be mildly funny for people to see, especially given all that's gone on the past few years, but outside of that, I don't really care about it because why bloody would I? It's not a show I've ever watched, and in my mind is built on a lie because I'd hardly call the people in there celebrities. Twats on TV is closer to what I think they are, but really I want to focus on Matt Hancock, or the public perception of Matt Hancock anyway, because it seems some of the people watching this tripe have forgotten all this smarmy snake actually did.
Yeah. You're quite emotional about that.
Well, it's just, it's been such a tough year for so many people, and there's William Shakespeare putting it so simply for everybody that, we can get on with our lives, and
I mean, shit, I've seen comments from people defending his actions over the past 2 years, which is why I decided to make this video.
Are you serious?
Clearly they haven't seen my Medical Zealot compilation featuring Matt the Pratt and have forgotten what this corrupt little shit weasel did. Either that or they are one of the full-bred sheeps who still to this day buy into the narrative sold to them over the past 2 years. This, we know, is still a thing because I recently spoke to someone who had been jabbed 5 times at this point. Yeah, I shit you not, they unironically told me they had been jabbed 5 times, which I've got to say got a little laugh out of me, before I simply said, so needing 5 in 18 months must mean it works well then. So yes, people are still following the science, as they say, even if the person I spoke to is now asking the questions that we asked in 2020, following our little chat. Here though we have the comment that really made me record this because it shows people would actually forgive these scumbags for what they did. Clearly this includes Matt Hancock and the culling of care home residents that, as you know, just ain't talked about. Now, for context, this comment comes from a Telegraph article written by Camilla Tominey that lies about Hancock's first day on the show. Many readers who actually watched the show have pointed this out to me, and so have people I've spoke to. This is not surprising considering it's the fake news media we're talking about here, but the article itself I don't care about. They can lie about him all they like because never a fuck was given by me. I was just given context, so the first line of his comment actually makes sense, and the public reaction to bullying is something I agree with because it's true. People don't like bullies, but I guess exceptions can be made for Hancock, and I'm sure many people will. Here though he writes, at the end of the day he's a human being, and it's pretty obvious that there's some playground bullying at work. Regardless of who it is, I can't stand bullying. Now, human being is a questionable description, I'm sure some would say, but let's get on to the real reason this needs to be utterly demolished. Here he goes on, a lot of people have very short memories. Yes, my friend, you might be one of them. Lockdowns were a mistake, particularly after the first initial few weeks. Talk about understatement of the bloody century or what? But we need to have some perspective. When it all kicked off, people who knew way more about viral infections advised him and the PM that a lockdown was necessary. Can you imagine if he ignored them all, saying he knew better and let hundreds of thousands of people die? That would have been catastrophic. Okay, here is some perspective. Hundreds of thousands would never have died. This is beyond bloody doubt. The only reason we have death numbers that we have now is because they used 28 days of a positive test to count them up. The model they used to justify lockdown had already been debunked by scientists before the first lockdown, which also leaves no excuse for the following lockdowns or restrictions. Scientists without a track record of getting it wrong, like Professor Ferguson has, pointed out that his model was pure bullshit, aiming for the worst case scenario with unrealistic assumptions that literally made no sense.
Thanks to some questionable modelling, poorly presented and often misrepresented, I think it's true to say that never before has so much harm been done to so many by so few based on so little questionable, potentially flawed data. I believe the use of modelling is pretty much getting up there for national scandal. This is not just the fault of the modellers, but it's how their work was interpreted by public health officials, by the media, and yes, by politicians, and sadly by government too. Modelling and forecast was the ammunition that drove lockdown and created a climate of manipulated fear. And I believe that creation of fear was pretty despicable and pretty unforgivable. I don't doubt that modelling is important, and I don't doubt there has been some good modelling, but too often it has been drowned out by hysterical forecasts. What I want to do above all is to understand why government, parts of the media, the public health establishment became addicted to these doomsday scenarios and then normalised them in our country with such depressing and upsetting consequences for many. And Professor Brendan Wren quotes, "Dodgy data and flawed forecasts have become the hallmark of much of the scientific establishment." What a damning quote. But I'll continue. "Which has traded almost exclusively in worst-case scenarios. The result, as UCL's Professor Francois Ballieu notes, is a loss of trust in government and public institutions, for crying wolf." And that's just it. Hysterical forecasts, models taken out of context, worst-case scenarios normalised. In the army, there's something called most dangerous course of action, and there's something called most likely course of action. And effectively, if you want to sum up with one sentence of how we've got this wrong, we have taken the most dangerous course of action, and we collectively, politicians, the media, the scientists, the health professionals, we have presented that as the most likely course of action. And it was not. It was not.
Oh yes, Hancock and that knew the model was bullshit because other scientists had told them this, you know, the same ones who were silenced whenever they tried to speak up against it. And these wasn't no tin pot scientists from some backwater place either. They're scientists from Oxford, Stanford and shit like that. Professors of evidence-based medicine and virology, not a bunch of sage commies with an agenda to push. Here, though, the commenter goes on. As it happens, he followed the advice of those who supposedly knew more. Yeah, supposedly is definitely the word. What responsible person in his position would have done differently back then? Well, the Swedish government did differently despite being shown the same data that he was, which even they said made no sense, so they ignored it.
Swedish epidemiologists looked at Imperial's work, and they compared it to their own experience. Their chief epidemiologist, Angus Tengel, said of Imperial's work, "The variables were quite extreme, always quite doubtful." Former chief epidemiologist Johan Gisek said Ferguson's models was, quotes, "almost hysterical." In the House of Lords, Viscount Ridley talked of a huge discrepancy and flaws in the model and the modelling. John Ioannidis from Stanford University said assumptions and estimates seemed substantially inflated.
Sweden, as it stands, actually makes the argument put forward by this commenter look even more ridiculous because not only did they refuse to lock down at the start, they didn't bloody do it at all. They followed the pre-2020 pandemic plans and got through it without the economic and social damage seen here. I mean, as it stands, we have insane amounts of excess deaths weekly and have for months now thanks to lockdowns and all else they did these past 2 years, and that's happening in almost every country except Sweden. This is a situation that many people predicted, as you know, and Matt Hancock himself actually ridiculed them, you might remember. Oh yes, this was relating to the Great Barrington Declaration that Matt Hancock himself dismissed in Parliament.
On the substance, the Great Barrington Declaration is underpinned by two central claims, and both are emphatically false. First, it says that if enough people get COVID, we will reach herd immunity. This is not true. Many infectious diseases never reach herd immunity, like measles and malaria and AIDS and flu. And with increasing evidence of reinfection, we should have no confidence that we would ever reach herd immunity to COVID, even if everyone caught it. Herd immunity is a flawed goal without a vaccine, even if we could get to it, which we can't.
That there shows you just how wrong this commenter is and anyone else who's talking about how Matt Hancock should be forgiven. But to be honest, there's a few of them doing it, so I'm not just digging this guy out. My anger at all this is not against the people who followed the bullshit, it's about the people who coerced and bullied them into doing it. This is actually why saying Matt Hancock is being bullied really don't cut through with me, because he bullied and coerced the public into compliance.
Mr. Hancock, you've introduced a law by which a perfectly healthy individual could be incarcerated for 10 years for wrongly misleading about the fact he or she had been to Portugal. Perfectly healthy individual locked up for 10 years. What is your legal background on that?
The position I find myself is that I think it is incredibly important that we protect our borders in order to keep people safe. And given all the progress that we're making, we've got to protect that progress. And that's the approach that I'm taking. I make no apologies for it. I think it is very important.
I'm not asking you to apologise. I'm just asking you to justify why it's the same stretch as if I was carrying a firearm, and it's longer if I attempted to have sex with a 13-year-old girl for coming in from Portugal. What makes you think that's the right stretch?
If I bullied and coerced people into doing what I think's right, I'll be arrested and put in prison. Politicians do it for literally 2 years to millions of people without a care in the world, and we should what, forgive them? To that I say, never in a month of fucking Sundays, mate.
If the milk turns out to be sour, I ain't the kind of pussy to drink it.
Now, thankfully, many people in the comments section are pointing out what Matt Hancock did and why it should never be forgotten, so I guess all is not lost. Matt Hancock, like every other politician from all sides and the media tosspot, must never be able to live down what they did during this. It went on for too long for them to say they didn't know it was wrong, so literally no excuses can be made.
Where